Hello neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look at installing the Firestone Air Command onboard air compressor. Now this is a light duty and for single path, and today it's going to be going on a 2019 GMC Sierra 1500. And this is what the compressor is going to look like installed, and you can see the ECUs right next to it. So relatively small footprint, and it's really nice that they actually have the whole harness included in a wire loom, so it's really easy to run. It's going to make it nice and clean looking. Now, what I really like about this system is the small footprint. The compressor can still fill up your bags with no problems, but other ones are pretty large and sometimes have a residual holding tank, and that makes it kind of tricky to mount up. This one, pretty easy to find a spot, and you can kind of just self-tap it in and know that it's going to stay safe under there. And also, something that's really nice about this system is the fact that it is controlled by an app on your phone. So you can kind of do it from the comfort of the cab of your truck. And the great part too is you're not having to run airlines in. As some of the other systems, you're controlled by toggle switches that have actual gauges. This really takes that out and makes the install so much easier compared to that analog system. This compressor is rated for up to 120 PSI, so it should cover most bags that you'll be putting on your vehicle, but a lot of your bags are actually rated a little bit lower, so just keep that in mind. That way you're not overinflating your bags. So the installation is pretty straightforward. The instructions are really good. They kind of give you a good layout of how it all goes, and plus the wiring harness is all one piece, and it's really just kind of plug and play for the most part. You'll have to do a little bit of drilling just for some self-tapping screws, but really it should be pretty easy, especially if you've done the airbags yourself. This shouldn't be a problem to get knocked out. And speaking of that install, I'm going to show you how we did it, and that way you can get your compressor installed. To begin the installation, you're going to want to grab your compressor, and you're going to see there's this little nipple, and this is going to attach to the side here. So we'll just go ahead and get that threaded in here, and this is going to route a air line to the air filter, and that's where it's going to pull the air from. So it's something to think about when we mount it up. Just kind of seeing which direction you want to route that filter. So I'm just using a 12mm socket, and you don't have to get too crazy here. These are brass, so they're going to be relatively soft, so something to think about. Don't over tighten. And this one actually has a thread lock on it. This is going to be the push connect, and this is actually going to disperse that air to our bags. So we want to at least engage 2 threads of that thread lock there. So I'm going to just hand tighten like that and tighten this down. You can use a wrench, but I generally have a little better luck here. This is going to be a 13mm socket, so it's going to make it a little bit easier. And I'm just going to get 2 threads started in. And just about like that. And so now we need to actually figure out where we want to mount this. Now, in the instruction manual, it doesn't actually say to lower your spare tire, but going ahead and lowering this down is going to make it easier for us to get you some good shots of the installation. And also just to have a little bit more clearance, because eventually you are going to want to run your manual lines to the back. You might as well take the heat shield down. It's just going to kind of open this up for us. So you're going to have a few 13mm bolts here. So it looks like we have a total of 6. So I'll go ahead and get those down. Then we can set our heat shield aside. With our spare tire and heat shield removed, it really opens up the possibilities of mounting, and you really do have a lot of different options. But my thought with this is to try to get it up out of the way so it's not going to make contact with anything, but also it's going to kind of stay away from some of the elements that might kind of splash up. So looking at the corrugation of the bed here, you can see this little cross beam. This is going to be a good spot. Now in the kit, they actually give you threaded bolts with a nut, and that's great if you can find a flat spot to mount it, but we're not so lucky here. It's going to be really tough to, run those through a frame and be able to tighten them. So what I've actually opted for is using some long self-tapping screws, and that's just going to put it through the metal. It's going to hold it nice and secure. And so looking at spots, I'm kind of thinking right about here. This is going to be really nice, not only to be able to still mount up the ECU as well and run our wiring, but also this little nipple, that's going to run out, and I can run the line down to be able to get the air filter where I need. And our push connect here is going to be able to be close to the bag, so making the connection is going to be a lot easier. So you can use a punch and kind of mark your holes, but I'll probably just kind of put this up here, make sure it's somewhat level, put my first self-tapper in, and then continue on for the rest of them. Now when tightening down, you're gonna see there's brass fittings here. There's some rubber, but you don't wanna get too crazy on tightening because it's gonna cause that brass to kind of deform. So just make sure it's snug. So I'll go ahead and mount this up, and then we'll come back under here. The next thing we're going to want to find a spot for is going to be the ECU here. And you want it fairly close to the compressor, as it is going to have some connections that are going to be close by. So I try to keep them within at least a 3-foot range, but I can actually just mount mine kind of close to this. Now they do have some really heavy duty zip ties here that route through it, and that way you can attach to just about anything that you need to. But I'm gonna go ahead and just use some self-tappers just to kind of mount this up, and we'll put it nice and clean next to our compressor. Now in the kit, there is a large bundle of wires here, and this is gonna be the connection point between the battery to get the power and actually plugging into the compressor and ECU. So it's really nice that it's all one piece, and it's gonna make it easy to run this. So this is going to go to the battery of the vehicle. This is going to route underneath. So we'll start by actually making the connections. So there's a red for our positive terminal on the battery, a black for the ground on the battery. Now you may say, oh, I can just ground it to the factory chassis or anything like that. And really, for optimal accuracy on the ECU, you're going to want to put that on the terminal. Now this guy here is a yellow wire, and this is not used. So you want to make sure it's still protected. So you can put a wire nut or just kind of electrical tape this. And you also have an inline fuse here, so that's going to protect any shortages that might happen. That way it's not going to damage any of the electronics. So I'm going to take this, run it up to the engine bay, and then pass the rest of the wires down and make my way to the compressor and the ECU. So I'm going to do that now, and I'll show you how I did it once it's all in place. So I've actually made the connections here on our compressor as well as the ECU. So on the end that we actually have back here from our wire loom, simply going to be this plug, goes right in there, nice and easy. And then you also have a spade connector, and I have it tucked back here, and that's just going to go to the red wire off of the compressor. And it's pretty nice because it already has the connector on there, so it's pretty hard to mess up. The only other wire you got to worry about here is going to be your black wire, and that's just going to go into a ground spot with a, it's got a ring terminal already on it, so a self-tapper, kind of anywhere where there's raw metal should be fine. So I just went ahead and kind of zip tied this up just to keep it clean. That way it's not resting against the compressor or able to touch the exhaust. So this kind of keeps it nice and clean. I still have access to my push connects here. So the rest of the harness will follow this. Kind of just routed this down using a lot of the factory wire loom. And in fact, pretty much the whole run I was able to do that. So it's going to make it pretty easy here. And I've left the zip ties on here. That way it's going to be a little bit easier to follow the path. You can kind of just follow those. So I just routed it over here. And then I made my way over to the passenger frame rail. And from there, I just really just followed this large wire loom the entire way. Just kind of making sure I put some zip ties every about a foot or so, or if there's a turn, just to kind of keep that slack down, and just followed this along. And the great part about following this is it's going to stay away from the exhaust down the middle. Now once you get to the actual engine bay, it does kind of get tight here because there is the muffler, but I was able to kind of tuck it over this way and feed it up over to our battery. So I'm going to lower the vehicle down, and I'll show you how I attached it up there. So I was able to actually route the harness up through here, and there's a nice little metal bracket. It's kind of a triangle. It's hard to see, but it's kind of right behind the battery, and it's got a large opening. So feeding it through there and zip tying it up held that in place. Now as far as tying into power, pretty easy here. In fact, GMC, this is a really nice design on their battery little cover here. You can see there's actually a spot already to run a wire out of here. So that's really cool. It keeps it nice and clean. So, and it's actually got a spot to keep that in place. So red wire, you're going to put on your positive terminal there, and then this routes out to that hole. And I just put a zip tie here, just kind of keep it out of the way of the negative. And then I actually reused the battery tie down bolt on our fuse holder just to kind of keep it clean. Now I did have to enlarge the hole just a little bit with a drill bit, but that way you're not having to drill any extra holes. You can actually use what you have there, and then you just run the negative to this negative terminal. So that's a 13, this is a 10, pretty easy. Now we still had that little extra yellow wire, so I just kind of kinked that over, taped the end of it, and you can see I've just bundled it up here and zip tied it. That way it doesn't get loose and kind of rattle around in the engine bay. So we're tied into power. This goes back on. Now all we need to do is make our airline connections. Now when it comes to running our airlines, one of the first things I did was actually attach to that nipple that we installed in one of the first steps off the compressor. And this is going to be for our air filter where it's actually pulling the air to compress. Now you want to put this in a place where it's not going to get wet or get dirt or anything like that. And you do want to actually put a coil in it, and that way it kind of becomes a water trap. It's not going to pull it in the compressor. So I've actually kind of tucked this up kind of by the fuel door, and I just kind of zip tied it up. That should keep it in place and also protected here. So routing that back, we just simply went kind of along the frame rail again and then just tied into our compressor. Now the other line we have off of our actual utilities here is going to be the one that plugs into the ECU, and that is going to really just monitor that pressure and know when to add or subtract to match where we set it when we use the app. And this just kind of coiled around. You need to do that again just like we did for the air filter, and that's just going to create that water catch as well. So I have that going into our T, which then routes over to this T, which eventually goes to each bag, and those are our stainless lines. Now, if your kit looks different because of the red tubing, that's because our customer actually has airlift bags, and I just went ahead and used his lines. So it may look a little bit different on some of the fittings here and there, but it's gonna be the same concept even with your Firestone. So pretty much here it is just going to each bag. So this is a single path, meaning you're only controlling both of the bags. You don't have individual control, but also we tied a manual fill as well. So that way, if your app isn't working or if the compressor's not working for whatever reason, you can actually still manually fill it by putting a Schrader valve on the back. So I just kind of took this, and you'll see I routed it all the way back, and this just goes to our mount. This should still have clearance for our spare tire. And this little bracket comes with the kit, and you just run the large zip ties around your hitch or whatever spot you find necessary, so that way you can actually manually fill if for whatever reason your other components aren't working. You still have that. Now I really tried to do my best to keep this away from the exhaust, but sometimes if the way you set yours up, it kind of gets pretty close and you're worried about that line actually melting. There are these little sleeves here, so you can slide this on the air tubing and then just zip tie it there if you need to, and that's just going to give it a little added protection. But again, that's kind of up to you depending on how you route it. My goal was to just, again, keep it away and zip tying it up and making everything clean. That way, over time, it's not going to be rattling underneath the vehicle. So now at this point, it's a good time to actually test to make sure that the app is working, the compressor's working, and that it's actually picking it up with the ECU. And we can also check for leaks while we put air in it. So this is going to be the app that you want, the Firestone Air Command. So I've gone ahead and downloaded it. We have it here. I've set it to 75 PSI. And so I know that I have pressure in the bags, but if I want to decrease it, it's a really easy app to use. There's two ways you can do this. So you can put your truck in accessory mode. As you can see, the voltage alert just wants to make sure it has enough power to do that. I'm going to proceed here. Already it's kicking on, so that's a good sign. But you're able to actually manually adjust it by a plus or minus, or you can actually kind of reel this wherever you need. So let's put it at, let's just say, oh, I don't know, we could do 30 PSI, something along those lines. You can hear it's gonna kind of disperse that pressure until it reaches that threshold of where I set it. So I actually know that it's at 39 because this little readout here, and if you want to, you can actually set memories too, which is really cool. So that way, if you're consistently at a pressure that you like, you can just press that. Say I want to drop it to 32, no problem. Just kind of bump that down to 32. And it's going to get there. I've gone ahead and just kind of bumped the pressure back up to about 60 PSI. And what I need to do now is check for leaks. So the first thing, obviously, listen for audible leaks. So far, so good. You can also use the app to see if that pressure is tapering off, but a good solid way to check is going to be using a soap water solution. I'm just going to go through and spray all of our fittings anywhere where we've made a connection here. And this is a good time to kind of give it a few minutes and see if large bubbles occur. And what that would be is just air kind of seeping out. It's going to create a quite large bubble. It'll stand out compared to some of these smaller ones. So go ahead, hit all of your fittings, any connections, and give it a minute or two and see if any of those bubbles form. So with the app working properly and all your leaks checked and fixed if necessary, the only thing left to do is get the heat shield and the spare tire back up. And that was a look and installation of the Firestone Air onboard air compressor system for a 2019 GMC Sierra.